You know, most sewing tech talks only take me a couple days to prepare for, but this one took a lot longer. Why? Well, I had to finish all these quilts just so I could show you some fancy bindings. We're going to piece bindings, and most importantly, we're going to pipe them. I'm Cathy, and this is Sewing Tech Talk. So now we're going to piece bindings and we're going to pipe some bindings. And there's a way that you put bindings on, there's a way that you join the seams, and there's a way that when you finish you join them too, and the way you turn the corner. So let's start out with a piece binding, because that's kind of the most simple. So what am I meaning about a piece binding? Well, a piece binding, what it has is it has piecing, kind of just like the quilt top does. In this particular one, I wanted to finish off the design, so I used some of the fabrics from the quilt to just piece the binding so it looks like when you finish it and you turn it over that everything's continued on to the other side. So that's a piece binding. You could even do something pieced in the corner. You could highlight a certain part of the quilt. Piece bindings just give you that, you know, when you're finished with the quilt and you're quilting, kind of sometimes you want it to be done, but really the creative opportunities, well, they just can start there because you can do some pretty clever stuff with the bindings. So now let's turn the corner. Let me show you how that's done, because I left this one so that we could do that. And you got to find it. Here we go. So now what I'm going to do is I'm sewing this binding on. It's the piece binding. I'm sewing it on the back and turning it to the front because I have a really nice foot for sewing it down. I'm going to show you that in a little bit. So here it is. I'm going to sew the binding on the back and turn it to the front. You can, of course, just as easily sew it on the front and bring it around to the back. I like this method, especially for the piece binding, because that means when I match everything, well, then I can see that it's matching. So I'm just going to be using the regular old sewing foot, and I'm going to set up my Altair, because we're sewing on the beautiful Altair today, with the LED guide light. I'm also going to attach a seam guide, which is an optional foot for the machine. So here's the seam guide. What the seam guide does is it attaches, there's a little screw hole right here, and I can attach the seam guide. Now I know I have the LED guide light and I use that for seam guidance all the time, but sometimes when you're going around a quilt, well, it's a big thing. It's kind of bulky, and it's kind of nice to have an extra little physical thing to butt that edge up against, because it's a long way around a quilt and you can get kind of tired as you go. So I use my seam guide. It's really nice. Now, in if your machine has that little hole in the front of the plate, either a brother or a baby lock machine, the seam guide will fit. You may need an alternate one. Maybe you don't have the option of having this kind of a screw-on seam guide. You can also get a magnetic seam guide, or maybe there's a seam guide that would fit your machine, specifically your machine. I am using the foot. And we're going to be making piping and adding some cording a little bit. I got this cord from one of those big box stores, and I got this one there as well. It's not traditional cord, but there's a whole bunch of it, and the price was right. This cord's about a 1/16 of an inch, and this one's about an 1/8 of an inch. So now, let's get started and sew this rest of this binding on. And what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to turn the corner. So let me show you how that works. Now, you notice how I adjusted the seam guide. I'm also going to turn on the LED guide light, which is right here on the machine. And that guide light's coming straight out, and it's going to show me where my seam line is, where my seam's going to be. It's coming straight out from the needle. You can see on the display of the machine that that red light is directly underneath. Let me move it so that you can see, and then I'll move it back. So I know that's right there. Now I've adjusted my seam guide on the side, the physical one, to help me keep everything in the straight and narrow. Now, what are the settings for this? Well, it depends, quite frankly, on the size of the binding that you're going to be making. This one is extra wide, so I'm doing this size seam. What you do is when you're getting ready to adjust and set up your seam, and I have a handout, and so all this is in the handout as well. So if you miss a little bit, go get the handout. It's in the description of the video, or go to moresew.com shop, and you can find my handouts there. But you're going to want to test the binding, whatever you're going to do. So what I do is I cut a little strip, I kind of mock it up, I kind of play with it, pin it on the quilt, and see where my seam needs to be. Like I said, that depends on the size that you're going to make. So I have it all set up now, and all I need to do is just sew up to that corner. Now when you come up to the corner, what you're going to do is you're going to flip and flop this binding to make a perfect 45 degrees fold on it, and it's going to perfectly turn that corner. Now, technically I need to stop exactly my seam width away from the bottom. That's so much to think about. What I do is I just sew pretty close to that, and when I turn the corner, you're going to see that the threads loosen up anyway. So you can sew to the end of this seam. Don't reinforce. No, you'll see what I'm doing. And I sewed a little bit beyond where I needed to be. I'm going to use my scissors on the Altair. Now let's turn that corner. I also have another video that I did on bindings, and it specifically goes into great detail about this with pictures and everything. So I'm going to flip my binding this way, and then I'm going to turn it back this way. The trick is I want this folded edge to be along the raw edge, and these two folded edges to meet. I'm just going to turn the corner, and start to sew. Now I'm not going to go very far because now I have to meet my pieced edges. Notice I put a pin in this side and I put a pin underneath. Well, I want these two pieced pieces to match. Now when you're calculating, what I usually like to do when I'm piecing my binding to go around, it's kind of hard to know exactly where you need to have it. So what I do is I kind of join it as I go. Now, where do you measure to make sure everything's going to fit? Because that corner looked a little tricky, didn't it? Well, you measure along the very outside raw edge of the quilt, and that's going to give you the perfect measurement for the length that this binding needs to be, for everything to match up when you get to the other side. Like I said, what I usually do is I kind of piece it as I go. Yes, it takes a little bit more time, but this is a fancy binding, right? So I'm going to continue on, and I'm going to sew the rest of this binding on. And then when I'm finished, what I want to do is I want to show you how you do that perfect diagonal seam join, because that sounds complicated, but it's really not. Okay, so I sewed around, I did the other corner, and now I need to match my two pieces. Well, it seems kind of intimidating because what we want here is we want a diagonal seam. Why? Well, if you're doing a diagonal seam for your binding, what happens is the seam creates extra bulk. And by putting it on the diagonal, you reduce that bulk. Yes, I had to have straight seams for all my pieces that kind of match the front. in a piece binding that kind of can't be avoided, but I like to put a diagonal seam wherever I can. So how do we do this tricky thing? Well, what we need to do is we need to finish and leave ourselves plenty of room, because if you sew very close to where you want this join, it's really tough to kind of manipulate the pieces. So what I do is I come fairly close to where things need to be, lay my binding out, kind of give it a trim somewhere towards-ish the middle-ish. What we're going to do is we're going to overlap these two. So I'm going to take this binding, lay it flat over the top of that one, and I'm going to overlap them. Now, you want to overlap these two bindings. Now, this is a French fold binding, which means that it has a folded part that's going to come around, and that's the part that I'm going to stitch out. This works absolutely the same for a single layer binding. What I need is I need to trim this so that they're overlapped exactly the same distance that they are wide. And we already have our measuring device, which is the little piece that I trimmed off. So I lay that right there. And you can see, let me put it upside down so that you can see it with the raw edge. I need to trim this binding right here. That means that they're overlapped exactly the distance that they are wide. And this works, like I said, with any width binding. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew these together with a diagonal seam. Take your pieces, turn one to the side, and I'm going to sew from side to side. Now this binding that I'm using, because I'm going to use it for another technique in a second, is a wider binding than I usually use. It's a 3-inch width strip, and I normally only use 2.5. But it doesn't really matter any size binding this technique works with. So now I'm going to take it and I'm going to sew from side to side right through there. Now the beautiful thing about having the LED guide light is I can absolutely see that opposite corner, because as you can see, you have to kind of manipulate things a little bit. Now I'm going to trim away that seam allowance, but let me show you that is a perfectly joined length that I need, and it's a diagonal seam. So don't forget, that works with just about every width of binding, and it gives you that perfect edge. Overlap it the same distance, and then just do that diagonal seam. Now, I made this binding extra wide. Let me show you briefly why. Because I'm going to make this into not a piped binding, but a corded binding. Now here's the binding that I just sewed. When you bring it around to the front, you can see, oh my goodness, that looks really cool. That really kind of matches. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a cord in this. And what the cord does is it gives you extra strength on the edge, and it makes it look kind of like it's double stitched. I'm going to use a 1/8 inch cord for this, but you can use a 1/16. You can use whatever size works for whatever cord you want on the outside edge. Basically, it's super simple. Before you sew the cord down, by binding down, you lay the cording right beside the raw edge, just like that. And then when you pull it around to the front, that cording is going to be caught right in that raw edge. You're going to stitch it down here with the quilt binding foot I'm going to show you in a second, and then you're going to stitch it along right in here. And that looks like, well, that looks like that. See how that cord is right along that edge? And it gives me kind of a really cool effect with double stitching. And this cord, well, this cord really stabilizes the quilt. So if you're going to hang a large quilt on a wall as a wall hanging or a display, this is a pretty good idea. Why? Because it keeps the quilt from stretching out on the sides. So it really gives you a neat effect, but it can also really strengthen that outside edge. So that's a pieced binding and a corded binding. But you know, you can do some fun other stuff with your binding. I did a lot of, before I go on, here's a cool quilt that I made, and let me show you how neat that binding looks with that double stitching. This is a slightly wider on the front, but see how it gives you that extra little definition on your binding, and it's really going to make this wall hanging sit really, really nice on the wall. So that's another cool way to use it. Just have it on that outside edge. It could be large, it could be small. Now let's go on and let's talk about really petite bindings and adding a little something on the inside before we go to piping. So here's a fun quilt that I did, and I wanted the binding on this quilt to be a little bit more petite, a little bit smaller, not your standard size. And I wanted to add something a little bit fun. So in the corner I did some applique, I did some yo-yos, so I wanted to add a little bit something extra to my binding. So I just pre-stitched a piece of rickrack around the outside edge. Now when you're putting the rickrack on, you're going to do it in a couple stages. It's kind of hard to manipulate everything, especially when you can't see it. Because I sewed this binding on the back and I'm going to pull it to the front just like I did on that other quilt. But when I pull it to the front, let me show you what that looks like. Oops, I got two layers here. When I pull it to the front, it's going to cover the edge of that rickrack. And look how I just get a fun little effect when I'm coming around that outside edge of it. Now this is a little bit smaller. It's a more petite binding. So instead of cutting my standard 2.5 inch strips, I only cut it at 2. And it's a double fold binding, which means that it's cut, folded over, and then that raw edge is sewn along the outside edge of the quilt. Like I said, it's all in your handout. So now, I'm going to sew this down and sew it over the top of the rickrack, which I've already basted before I sewed my binding on, just like I did the other one. But I want to show you, before I forget, this is a wider rickrack. If I was to use a smaller one, I'd have to have it in a different position. Can you see that I would need to have it out here, maybe a different width so that my binding caught it? So pretend I'm doing that. What I would do is I'd set up my machine on the top of the quilt, even though I'm going to be sewing it on the back side, and I'm going to be basting that down. And this is where my seam guide and my LED guide light are really going to come in handy. So I can use my seam guide for the edge of the quilt. Do you see how it's like on the edge of the quilt right here? And on my seam guide, it's going to show me exactly where that edge of that rickrack needs to be. So essentially I have two guides to show me exactly where I need to be. I would sew my rickrack down, then sew my binding on from the back to bring to the front, and now I need to sew it down. But I'm going to use that quilt binding foot for that. Let me bring another player to the party. This foot is pretty cool. What it is a bi-level foot, and you can see on the back how one side is a little bit thicker than the other side. What happens is that rides along the binding and helps me sew absolutely straight, because this foot is not going to be on this jaunty angle. So when I put this foot on, this part rides right along that edge of that lip, and it rides really flat. there is a little guideline here for you to know where the edge of that fold over binding is going to be. So I have it just like that. Let me put the foot on. And I'm going to adjust my seam guide on the side so it's going to hold that quilt in position as well. So now as I'm stitching, what's going to happen is I'm going to adjust my needle so that it's coming down right there. And I know I'm just going to catch that edge of that binding. So you can see how pretty that is. It's just right along the very, very edge. And it's a really efficient way to sew your binding down. Now this foot is a bi-level foot, like I said, and it works really, really well for quilt bindings. But what if you're doing some other stuff as well? Well, because it's a bi-level foot, you can sew next to something that's really, really thick. So for example, if I'm sewing on a very thick trim, like this chenille rickrack, well, it's pretty thick and bulky. Let me take off my seam guide and show you. If I'm sewing along the edge, the bi-level guide will lie right along the flat part of the project that I'm working on. And this big bulky thing, well, the foot's going to ride level. I think I need to change threads for this particular application. So let me do that, and then when we come back, let's do some piping. Oh my gosh, it's so pretty. Now, let's put some beautiful, delicate piping just inside of our binding. It looks really elegant. Now, it adds that extra little color. Say you want to add, you're putting your binding on and you need that extra little something to make the quilt sparkle. Well, mini piping is the way to go. You can even color block it. On this quilt, I wanted to highlight the transition between one and the other. So I changed from a yellow to this pretty chartreuse green. And it really, on this quilt, it highlights the one area that I wanted to highlight. So now, when you're doing mini piping, there's a special foot that you're really going to want. And it's called the piping foot left. Remember, everything's in your handout. Now, when you're going to do little piping, you can surely go out and you can find little piping, little mini piping to go into your quilt. And it's already made. But it's really simple to make your own. And think of the design possibilities when you can choose your own colors. Because quite frankly, colors in this are very limited. So now let's get to making our piping and putting it onto the quilt. Now when I make my mini piping, I use a strip of bias fabric. The fabric's cut on the bias. Like I said, there's another video and another handout that shows you bias. Basically it's cut in a 45-degree angle, and that gives it a little bit of extra stretch, and it flows smoothly around the top. I went to that big box store and I got this cording, and I have a whole bunch of it. Let me show you the mini piping foot. When you're choosing cord, what you want to look for is a cord that's going to fit into this slot on the bottom of the foot. It fits in perfectly right along in there. And that slot holds the cord perfectly in place as we're sewing. Now to make our bias, it's as simple as cutting your bias strip and using the foot to pre-sew it to make your own, just like you went out to the store and bought it. So let's put the foot on. I'm going to use a matching thread, top and bottom. And when I put this cord on the inside, what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the cord extend out farther than I have my fabric. And I'm not going to start sewing to the very end. I'm going to start sewing down here. Why do I do that? Well, I want to be able to join this cording to, this piping to each other, just like I did that on the edge of that binding, on the edge of that with the black and white fabric. It works the exact same way. You overlap it the same distance that it is wide. So now, let's make some piping. What you want to do is you want to get it so that the cording is inside right there, right along that fold. And it fits right into the slot of the foot. So slot it in just like you did. Now, this is wider than we need it to be, so it's easy to sew. We're going to come along after a little bit, after we sew it, and use a piping trimming tool which is available. It also has that slot, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use it to trim this piping after I finish it. And I can move my needle position. It really wants my needle position to be right in the center to sew the perfect little piping. But I'm just pre-making it right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my center needle position, but I'm going to go over just a tiny bit using my left-right shift. That moves it over just a tiny little bit when I'm sewing my cording in. Remember, this is just the preliminary. We're going to sew it to the quilt in a little bit. What I've done is I've actually pre-made my little piping. Like I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my binding trimming tool and I'm going to go over, after I finish all the binding I need for my quilt, put the cording in that slot and use my rotary cutter to trim right along there to get a perfect thickness all the way through, all the way down. And that makes it easy to attach it to my quilt. Now remember how we attached that rickrack? What we did is we put it on and we used both our seam guide and our LED guide light to know exactly where the positioning of this is. Well, the same is true with this piping. What works for one also works for the other. So I am going to sew it on the front side of my quilt. Let me show you how I did that. I'm going to sew it on before I put the actual binding on the top of it. And when I put my binding on, what I do is I use a single layer. Once again, I cut it on the bias because it flows really smoothly. I'm not using that double fold technique like I did on the other quilts because this is thinner and you can really have it snap into that channel on the bottom of the mini piping foot. But first of all, we're going to baste it down to our quilt. So here it is. Now I'm going to put it on my quilt and you can see that piping is still going to fit in that channel. And let's take my seam guide, because remember, I need a double seam reinforcement to get this to the right place. So let's put the seam guide on, and what it's going to do, it's going to ride along the right hand side, that raw edge. Check. Now this, I might need to come in just a tiny bit. So let's engage our LED guide light and let's move it over so we know exactly where that piping needs to be. Can you see how I have now a double check where that piping needs to ride? And I'm just going to baste it down once again, just a little bit on the inside. And you can see my double stitching right through there. Check and double check. Now it's time to actually sew the binding on top of this piping. So here's my binding, and what I'm going to do is I lay it right on the top side. Can you see how perfectly that stitches right in there and you don't see any stitching? Well, I did that by going exactly where I needed to be, which is right in the middle. I don't necessarily need my LED guide light, but I am going to use my seam guide to hold that right on the inside edge. So I've already sewn this, but you can see how that piping fits right in that groove, and it keeps me sewing it just perfectly. How do you turn the corner? Well, the same as you did on the other quilt. You take it, you fold it back. Notice how you do a clip on the inside of that piping so it turns the corner. That fold and this raw edge are meeting, and I'm just going to lay this right into that slot in the bottom of the foot, and it's going to make me look like I know exactly what I'm doing, and you can feel it through this single layer. And we're just going to sew down that edge and adjust everything so it's exactly where you know it needs to be. Can you see how this single layer of fabric just fits right where that piping is, and it fits right in that slot? And when I turn it over to the other side, you can see everything looks just perfect. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my binding to the back. I should have picked things that didn't end with ing. The piping's on the quilt and the binding's going to go around to the back. And I am going to sew this down by hand. If you're clever and you make it big enough, maybe you could use that quilt binding foot or the mini piping foot or the seam guide. It all needs to be in your arsenal to get a really creative edge to your quilt. Remember, when you finish the quilt, you got to quilt it. When you finish quilting it, the creativity doesn't stop there. So thank you for staying with me today. Finish those quilts and put something really fancy on the edge. It's really that finishing touch. I'm going to send it off to George. He's going to tell you a little bit more about the Altair. It's a beautiful machine for whatever quilting you're going to do.
Thanks, Kathy. As always, that was an incredible presentation. It really solidifies that the Baby Lock Altair and the Baby Lock Meridian truly, dollar for dollar, are one of the most advanced machines on the market. Now with this special upgrade kit, it's even more advanced. So I want to go over a special offer we have on the upgrade. So first of all, the upgrade kit itself has all the software features to bring the Altair and the Meridian up to the Altair 2 and the Meridian 2, which is their new models. So some of the features like matrix copy, 50 new different designs. Couching actually has a yarn couching foot and several designs. And then of course, it has that 2-point laser positioner. So those are some of the software and more features that are being added. But it also has that 7 by 12 inch magnetic hoop. This is a flat magnetic frame that gives you all kinds of versatility, but for quilting and for other fabrics, it is truly one of the best hoops out there. For quilting, you can use that 2-point laser and truly do edge-to-edge quilting with your hoop. So the upgrade kit, we have it together with a special bonus for a limited time. So what we're doing, we're including a special selection of Madeira thread that is a 18 spool collection. It's called a Sense of Green box, and this is exclusive for this kit. We're also including a design download from OESD, Embroidery Online, as well as an exclusive collection of Baby Lock designs. Now this is really thorough, and this is from Baby Lock educators and contributors, and what they've done is they've put together a collection of their own personal designs, and these are only available with this bundle. And so with all these different designs that you see here, this total package would have a value of $1,234 if bought individually, and you get all of this for a limited time for $799. And you can click on the link to order this, or give us a call at 1-800-865-9664. Now, let's say you're watching this and you don't have the Baby Lock Altair or Meridian, and you see, wow, this is an incredible machine. Well, right now, we have the Altair 2, which is the combination sewing and embroidery machine, or the Meridian 2, which is the dedicated embroidery machine, on sale. And you can click on a link in the description to go right to that page. But these are machines for embroidery. They have a large 9.5 by 14 embroidery area. All kinds of editing features with this large color screen. The Altair 2 is an incredible sewing machine with automatic fabric sensors, a laser for seam guidance. It even has stitches that sew like automatic stippling. These machines are incredible, but you gotta contact us on these machines because I tell you, you can spend almost double the price on other models and not get near the features. But give us a call at 1-800-865-9664 if you'd like to discuss these models, or click on the link to order.